Number 10. The Lost Airman. Edward Miller was killed on November 22, 1952. He was flying in a Douglas C-124 Globemaster troop transport plane with 51 other military men en route to the Elmendorf Air Force Base near Anchorage. But the plane lost its navigation as it came in over the mountains, got swept into an Alaskan blizzard, and the plane crashed into the side of a jagged mountain. This was about 9,600 feet up on a glaciated peak. Tragically, Edward Miller and every other man on the plane died. Their bodies and all their belongings were covered in just days under feet and feet of ice and snow. For the last almost 70 years, the wreckage and the bodies have been hiding under the ice of the Colony Glacier. But Edward Miller is now going home. His body, along with the remains of dozens of other men who died in the crash, have finally been recovered. Military searchers located the wreckage and unearthed all 52 bodies of the lost. And believe it or not, the recovery had a lot to do with the sudden and rapid melting of the glacier since the early 2000s. In 2012, an Alaskan Army National Guard crew in a Black Hawk helicopter spotted the wreckage poking out of the ice. From there, it was just a matter of organizing a recovery team and breaking the Army men out of their icy prison. Number 9. World War I Bunkers. A melting alpine glacier in Europe has revealed a bunker used way back in World War I. Not just one bunker either, but an entire series of tunnels and hideouts that have been lost for nearly a century under thick ice. The biggest and most impressive cave shelter was found in northern Italy, originally used during the war to shelter about 20 Austrian soldiers. These soldiers were stationed at Mount Scorluzzo. According to historian Stefano Morosini, they were part of the White War, where soldiers battled each other high up in the frigid Alps, where the temperature could drop to -40 degrees. Inside the half-frozen shelter, archaeologists found preserved food, kitchenware, and jackets that the soldiers had made from animal skins. These artifacts show just how terrible the soldiers' lives were as they lived in the extreme conditions. Not only did they have to fight the enemy, they also had to put up with avalanches, horrifying temperatures, and extreme isolation. The only reason this cave shelter was even discovered all these years later was because of the warming in the Alps melting the frost and ice. But even still, much of the cave base is still frozen solid and unable to be explored. Number 8. Ancient Wolf Puppy. In the summer of 2016, a gold miner working in the Yukon Territory of Canada came across something incredible. He was blasting a wall of permafrost with a water cannon to see what he might find underneath. For Neil Lovelace, he was hoping to find gold. What he discovered instead was the oldest, most intact wolf mummy ever discovered. Ever! Thankfully, Neil was able to rescue the frozen puppy from the permafrost and place it inside of a freezer until paleontologists could arrive on scene. The ancient wolf pup was a juvenile female who lived at a time when Canada was home to mastodons and other crazy animals that we can hardly even imagine today. Archaeologists were able to date the wolf puppy back 57,000 years. This truly was an unprecedented discovery, especially since most of the cool Ice Age animals are found in Siberia. But this one was Canadian, in the far north where the ice caps used to be extraordinarily thick. The young gray wolf had likely been part of the population that migrated across the Bering Land Bridge from Siberia into America. She died at only 7 weeks old, from something researchers can't quite pinpoint. She's so amazingly preserved that her hair is still soft. Number 7. A missing restaurant worker. Here's something you don't see every day. In New Hope, Pennsylvania, a man was discovered behind a local restaurant literally encased in ice. He was discovered by a builder at the restaurant who was doing some renovations. The builder noticed something kind of peculiar inside the swimming pool behind the restaurant and went to take a closer look. That was when he saw what appeared to be a human body stuck under the frozen surface. The builder called the cops. The cops had to chisel the man out of the ice. And that was when things got really strange. The cops took the man's ID from his wallet, which also happened to be frozen solid. The man was identified as Jose Quiroz Marcial, a person who had been missing for nearly a month. His friends had assumed Jose had been picked up and detained by US immigration officials, but instead, he had somehow fallen into the pool and froze in a giant block of ice. The police don't even have any idea how he got into the pool. The whole place is surrounded by high wooden fences. He would have had to jump over the fence, trip over the edge, and then drown before eventually freezing. Number 6. Seawolf Submarine. The USS Seawolf is a fast attack submarine commissioned back in July of 1997. It was the first of the 3 Seawolf class submarines currently in the Navy. It's quiet, fast, and can carry at least 50 torpedoes or 100 mines. It also has the uncanny ability of traveling through brutal Arctic terrain. It was recently deployed to the North Pole on a 6-month mission. The sailors on board spent a full 2 months submerged, passing through the Bering Strait near the border of Russia, sailing under 30 feet 9 meters of solid ice, and ultimately punching up through that very ice sheet at the North Pole. It took them 5 whole hours to clear the ice off their hatches, just so everyone could pop out and have some fresh air. The commander of the sub, Jeff Byerly, called it a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, and one that not many people get to have. There was nobody in the North Pole except for those climbing out of the submarine. Would you ever embark on a journey to the North Pole by spending 2 months underwater in a submarine, trapped not only under the water but also under 30 feet, 9 meters of ice? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below, and if you're liking this video, be sure to hit the thumbs up and subscribe button if you haven't already. Number 5. The Antarctic Pyramid. Deep in the cold and brutal wilderness of Antarctica, there seems to be a pyramid from a lost civilization that lived hundreds of thousands of years ago. The Antarctic Pyramid was spotted thanks to Google Earth, looking exactly like the Pyramid of Giza except blanketed in ice and snow. But here are the facts. We know Antarctica was once covered in a lush forest hundreds of thousands of years ago. Antarctica had not a scrap of ice on it and was actually more like what the Amazon jungle is today. This means it would have been habitable for an ancient race of people. But these conditions were at a time before human beings had evolved. If a civilization really did live here, they would have been the first human civilization on the planet. Then there's the issue with geology. Eric Rignot, a professor at the University of California, says it's not a pyramid at all. He says it's just a mountain that happens to look a lot like a pyramid. So, we have geologists refuting the theory of the Antarctic Pyramid. We also have the possibility that a mysterious ancient race of beings built the monument and it's since been buried in ice. Since the pyramid is so far away at the bottom of the world, the debate won't be settled for quite some time until somebody actually goes down there and physically investigates. Number 4. Chile Sharks. In 2018, as the eastern seaboard was getting rocked by gusty winds from the Arctic and horribly frigid temperatures, sharks began to wash up on the beach. And yes, they were frozen like shark popsicles. 4 thresher sharks in a row were found frozen stiff on the shores of Cape Cod. But just wait, these sharks didn't freeze to death because of the cool weather. Greg Skomel, a local fisheries scientist, says they likely got stranded in shallow water while trying to migrate south. Thrasher sharks are notorious for migrating late, normally in December after blue sharks and mako sharks are already long gone. But the early blasts of cold caused them to panic and migrate early, which meant they got stuck on mudflats moving too close to the shore. Then once stuck, it was only a matter of time until they turned to solid ice and were pushed to the shore. Number 3. Mammoth Brain. The mummified brain of a woolly mammoth was found frozen in Siberia. According to the experts, it is the most intact mammoth brain ever found. How old, you ask? It's 39,000 years old, still complete with its folds and its blood vessels. It was discovered way back in August of 2010, near the remote town of Yukagir in Russia. Researchers named the mammoth Yuka, saying it was probably between 6 and 9 years old at its time of death. After the mammoth and its brain were discovered, they were transported to an ice storage for preservation. From there, the specimens have been moved around the country all the way to Moscow to be put on display. But what's truly amazing about the discovery is that researchers were able to examine the mammoth brain using CT and MRI scans. They could actually see the cerebellum of a woolly mammoth, something that's never been done before in history. Anastasia Kharlamova from the Russian Academy of the Medical Sciences says studying the whole brain of the mammoth could help figure out what kinds of complicated behaviors it had. Researchers now believe the woolly mammoth was extremely similar to modern elephants in how it acted. The only really big difference between the two was that the mammoth had a whole lot more hair. Number 2. Prehistoric worms. In the Siberian permafrost, researchers have discovered tiny worms from 42,000 years ago. According to a report from Live Science, these frozen worms were then brought back to life. We all know the feeling of waking up from a really long nap and feeling disoriented. But imagine how these worms must have felt when they were roused from their slumber of over 40,000 years. The worms are nematodes, microscopic critters that live in soil. Scientists found them thanks to the rapidly melting permafrost. They had been suspended in something like cryogenic stasis ever since the Pleistocene era, and yet being frozen for tens of thousands of years seemed to have no negative effect on the worms. Scientists revived 2 species of them successfully. It's not clear what exactly this discovery means in the larger scope of things. We already know a lot about nematodes. They live up to almost a mile below the Earth's surface, deeper than any other animal. Some of these worms even have 5 different mouths, while some worms have adapted to living inside the intestines of slugs. They are some of the most diverse and adaptable multicellular animals in the world, and now we know they can sleep for nearly 50,000 years in the ice. Number 1. Atlatl darts. In Canada's Yukon, archaeologists made an incredible find inside a melting patch of ice. Jennifer Herx, the heritage manager of the Carcross Tagish First Nation, uncovered a fully intact atlatl dart. This is rare because fully intact darts are almost never found. Usually, it's just fragments, but this one was complete, an entire ancient spear used at least 1,000 years ago. The indigenous people who lived in the Yukon, way up in Canada's northmost region, used the tools for hunting. An atlatl dart is basically just a long wooden shaft with a stone point tied to the end, then decorated with feathers. When woodland caribou gathered on the northern ice patches, the indigenous hunters would converge and take down as many as possible. Sometimes they left their tools behind. This must have been one of them, discarded after a caribou hunt and then frozen over by ice for 1,000 years.
Number 10. St. Ignatius Hospital. The St. Ignatius Hospital is a derelict house of horrors. On the plaque outside the hospital, there's a Latin inscription that roughly translates to, "The love of Christ impels us." A little too reminiscent of The Exorcist, if you ask us. The building was established in 1982 as a Catholic hospital in Colfax, Washington. It remained operational until 1964, when it was simply too outdated to keep functional. The property then turned into an assisted living home until the year 2000. After that, it was shut down and abandoned. The hospital remained abandoned until 2015, when it opened for public tours based on the outrageous claims that there are ghosts living inside. We don't know exactly whose ghosts these are or where exactly they came from, but the hospital has been featured in all kinds of ghost hunting TV shows throughout the past decade. If there are ghosts in there, nobody has ever actually documented one. Still, that hasn't stopped thousands and thousands of visitors from all across the country coming in the middle of the night to try and spot a ghost or two for themselves. Number 9. Elda Castle. Elda Castle was once owned by the co-founder of Abercrombie & Fitch. You know, that preppy store in all the malls with all those tall pictures of models? It's like Hollister's cousin. Anyways, the castle was built on about 50 acres of land in New York State way back in the 1920s. Today, the mysterious castle is abandoned, empty, and, quite frankly, not looking too good. It has sold twice in the past 2 decades, but nobody ever lives there. The first time was in 2001 for $1.5 million. The second time was 10 years later for about $3.75 million. Talk about a booming real estate market. The castle was built for David T. Abercrombie and designed by his wife. They named their new castle Elda, which is an acronym for their 4 children. But what should have been a long life of happiness in a castle turned into tragedy. 1 year after completion, their daughter Lucy died in an accident. Then in 1931, 3 years later, David himself died of rheumatic fever. 6 years after that, his son died in an accident. The kids just kept dropping dead, and so the castle sat empty for years and years. It suffered damage from fires and was vandalized repeatedly. Nobody ever did live in the castle again, and now it's just sitting in the middle of the forest like a haunted manor. Number 8. Cuba's unfinished power station. There is a mysterious, unfinished nuclear power station sitting abandoned on Cuba's Caribbean coast. The ugly, broken, and never completed station is a bizarre monument to a time when Cuba and their friendship with the Soviet Union posed a serious threat for America. As you may already know, Cuba depends massively on imported fuel. Fidel Castro wanted to solve the energy crisis. Going nuclear really seemed like the best option, and with the power plant funded with Soviet cash, there was no real downside. The power station would be enough to propel Cuba into the 21st century. Construction got underway in 1963, with Cuba even building a new city just to house the workers for the plant. Naturally, the US was not thrilled. The nuclear plant would be just 180 miles from Key West in Florida, but it didn't matter in the end. The fall of the Soviet Union spelled disaster for what could have dramatically changed history, especially for the island of Cuba. The project was closed in 1992 because the money from Moscow vanished. At the time, the first reactor was about 97% complete. Just a little more time in Cuba would have had their very own nuclear generator. But now, it's just a creepy abandoned structure in the middle of nowhere. Number 7. The Virginia Renaissance Fair. The Virginia Renaissance Fair was a failed attempt at a kind of medieval theme park for nerds. Today it looks like an abandoned village from the 13th century that archaeologists never bothered to excavate. It was open only from between 1996 and 1999, designed to be a replica medieval village where people could go to live out their fantasies, but whoever built this place assumed a lot more people would show up. After just 2 years, there were pretty much no customers. The owners had no choice but to close the park, lock the gates, and abandon it. All the structures were left to rot. Even today, the structures are still rotting. Everything is infested with ticks. There are dead animals everywhere. The place stinks like decay, and you'd have to be really brave to explore the dilapidated buildings. They may be standing right now, but they could fall over at any minute in a hail of debris and spider eggs. If the Virginia Renaissance Fair were still open today, would you dress up in your best medieval clothes and go check it out? Let us know in the comments below, and if you're liking this video, be sure to hit the thumbs up and subscribe buttons if you haven't already. Number 6. Tea for Two. About 300 feet from a hiking trail in Cumbria's Lake District, somebody abandoned a table and chairs, with tea for two laid out and waiting to be enjoyed. Ashley Cooper said that when she stumbled upon the tables and chairs completely by accident, she first thought it was an art installation, but it was pretty obvious upon closer inspection that somebody had recently set up their very own tea party in the middle of the woods. Half-eaten food was still on the plates, there were glasses of fuzzy wine abandoned, and there were even desserts that had gone uneaten. It looked as though a couple had set up their own private dinner party in the woods, then vanished into thin air before they could ever finish it. But that's probably not what actually happened. Ashley believes the table was probably set up by a pair looking to take Instagram photos. They were then too lazy to clean up after themselves. Either that or something incredibly more mysterious that I can't even speculate on happened in the woods. If the couple didn't leave behind their supplies, and I mean, who in their right mind would leave an entire dining room in the forest, then perhaps something nefarious went down. Number 5. Whispers Underground. A man with a camera was exploring one of the more mysterious abandoned places in Australia when he met a ghost. It's called the Waldeck Mine, and its history goes back 150 years. Men once toiled deep within the earth here, under the most brutal conditions as they searched for gold. But like pretty much every gold mine in the world by now, the Waldeck mine closed and was abandoned in the forest canyons of Australia, left to its own destruction. Descending into an ancient mine is not a good idea. The urban explorer who filmed his adventure realized it wasn't a good idea when he wandered a little too deep into a tunnel and heard what he thought were whispering voices. And to be honest, I've seen the video. Unless he manipulated it using some kind of software, it definitely sounds like deeper down the tunnel was a small group of people whispering. Sure, it could have been the wind, but it also could have been the disgruntled spirits of miners still trapped in the underground tunnel. Suffice to say, the explorer promptly got out of there. Number 4. McNallys Island. McNallys Island, not to sound too presumptuous, is probably one of the most fascinating abandoned islands that you've never heard of. It's located in Nova Scotia, Canada. It's the biggest island in the Halifax harbor, and local people don't even know it's there. At least, not all of them know it's there. The island was originally settled by the Britons in 1750, with the McNabb family living on it until 1934. But what's really cool is that the abandoned island today is filled with forgotten fortresses that were built throughout Halifax's history. There are also abandoned houses built by the original settlers in the 1700s. There's an old cemetery that still has the bones of the earliest island residents. The remains of a soda pop factory from a century ago can be found on the island. There are also over 3 forts and a battery, which was installed during World War II. You can even find the remains of an anti-submarine net that was strung across the harbor to keep submarines out of Halifax. Number 3. Burwash Correctional Center. The Burwash Correctional Center in Ontario, Canada doesn't really look all that appealing. It's a provincial prison that was abandoned a long time ago and has been gradually beaten down by the frigid northern walls. It first opened in 1914 and was so popular that a community grew around the prison. The prison inmates actually built housing for about 1,000 residents, all of whom worked at the prison or at the nearby farm. But by 1975, the world had moved on. The prison was outdated and too costly to keep running, so it was closed and abandoned. In the mid-1990s, most of the buildings were demolished. The only ones left standing were the main prison complex and the cemetery. The ghoulish cemetery was believed to have between 12 and 20 prisoners still hidden underneath the soil. But what's truly amazing is just how in the middle of nowhere this place is. You can't even reach it by car or SUV. The only way to get to the prison is to park on the side of the road near some railroad tracks and then bushwhack through the forest for about 2 miles. Number 2. Smaravyeva. Smaravyeva is an old military base in Closed City that was used by the Soviets. A closed city was a type of military encampment where soldiers and their families lived. Everyone inside was closed off to the outside world because of whatever military stuff they were doing inside. After the fall of the Soviet Union around 1994, many servicemen and pilots who had previously been located in East Germany were shipped to the base of Smaravyeva. At that time, the town had a population of about 4,000 residents. But then tragedy struck in 2008, with reforms that meant the airport was closed, the gas supply to residents was cut off, and nobody had any alternative but to pick up their stuff and flee. By 2010, the base and town were completely deserted. But the base is still filled with military equipment today, specifically military aircraft. There are plenty of Sukhoi Su24s littering the crumbled base. A lot of the best stuff has been pillaged by looters, but the skeletons of the aircraft are still there, as well as their destroyed concrete bunkers. Number 1. Grand Island East Channel Lighthouse. Work on the Grand Island East Channel Lighthouse was supposed to start in 1867, but the drowning of the foreman in charge of the project caused construction on the lighthouse to be postponed until a year later in 1868. That summer, the lighthouse was finished, and the first lighthouse keeper was appointed. In 1891, the lighthouse was struck by lightning, causing serious damage to the tower and the affixed house where the lighthouse keepers lived. Then, in 1898, storms had eroded the shore so badly that the lighthouse was no longer stable where it was. It needed to be moved at least 200 feet back from the water of Lake Michigan. As time went on, the lighthouse wasn't needed as much as it once was. On October 29, 1908, the lighthouse keeper lit the lamp one final time. After that, the lighthouse was left completely abandoned. It's been empty for over 100 years, but what's really bizarre is that in 1913, the lighthouse and its 44 acres were sold to 20 different members of a local moose lodge. Each of them controlled 1/20th of the abandoned property. Over the years, these shares have changed hands so many times that nothing has ever been done to preserve the structure. It's still sitting where it was a century ago, just collecting dust, all creepy and empty.
Number 9. Likichev Plant. Founded in Moscow in 1916, the Likichev Plant built some of the country's most iconic cars, trucks, military vehicles, and other heavy equipment. At the time, it was called the Moscow Automobile Society. It was the first Soviet factory to manufacture trucks with the development of the AMO F-15, which bore an uncanny and remarkable resemblance to the Italian-made Fiat 15 truck. During World War II, the plant produced mortars and grenades for the Red Army. It also built around 100,000 vehicles that were used in the Allied war effort against the Nazis and the other Axis powers. Over the years, the factory employed 65,000 people with a 6,000-strong workforce at its height. That's a lot of jobs. This site was massive, like a city within a city, and it contained countless production units. It was said that it would take a year to walk past them all. The final car was built there in 2012. The following year, the company declared bankruptcy. Most of the buildings were dismantled, and very little of the original site remains today. Number 8. Russian Mafia Resort. Before they're able to spend any of their ill-gotten gains, organized crime groups have to somehow make their earnings appear legitimate. This process is called washing or laundering money, and there are many different ways of doing it. Back in the early 2000s, the Russian Mafia came up with plans to build a luxury resort along the Bulgarian coast specifically for this purpose. Known as Costa del Croco, this seaside holiday complex would consist of 294 upscale apartments when finished. Construction began in 2007, and not long after that, rumors began to swirl about the project being tied to organized crime. It soon came to light that a notorious mobster named Konstantin Tsiganov had come up with the idea for Costa del Croco as a front for laundering his dirty money. He used his relationships with Bulgarian politicians to invest millions into the property without falling under legal scrutiny. But Tsiganov's connections only went so far in securing his fortune. When the global financial crisis hit in 2008, real estate values collapsed and people around the world stopped investing in properties. In addition to these newfound financial problems, there was a power shift in Bulgaria, and Tsiganov could no longer rely on his friends in power to overlook his money laundering activities. Construction at Costa del Croco ground to a screeching halt, leaving behind a series of unfinished seaside buildings. Tsiganov fled Bulgaria, and there's no way to retrace the financial activities revolving around the development. Ordinary investors were screwed out of the hard-earned money that they spent on what ultimately became a useless concrete and steel eyesore along the coastline. Number 7. Confranc Station. During the 19th century, it became clear that there needed to be more options for traveling between Spain and France. At the time, there were only 2 border crossings, and they simply couldn't keep up with the amount of people who were coming and going. People love to travel, after all. Officials decided to alleviate the problem by building a grand train station in the village of Confranc in the Spanish Pyrenees. It was meant to be a major transportation hub that would accommodate cross-border railway traffic. Confranc International Railway Station opened in 1928. 3 years after it opened, a huge fire broke out in the lobby. It spread to other parts of the station, causing extensive damage. Then, after the Spanish Civil War broke out in 1936, Spanish dictator Francisco Franco had the tunnels on the Spanish side sealed to prevent gun smuggling. During World War II, both cargo and passengers passed through the station, which sat along an escape route for Jews and Allied soldiers who were fleeing the Nazis. By the 1960s, the station was in serious decline, and the future of the railway it sat along was in jeopardy. Safety concerns arose due to chronic underfunding, and in 1970 a train derailed and destroyed a bridge on the French side of the Pyrenees. The government decided not to rebuild the bridge, and without it, the cross-border rail line could no longer operate. In the meantime, the nearby village's population decreased dramatically as a result of the decline. Confranc still serves a handful of trains on the Spanish side, but the station is mostly abandoned and derelict. It may be revived at some point, however, thanks to the ongoing efforts of the local government and funding from the European Union. Number 6. Meissen Castle. In the Belgian city of Liège, you'll find the ruins of a noble residence known as Meissen Castle. Built during the 17th century, the decaying structure was once a vast estate that belonged to the Marquis of Liège. It was destroyed and rebuilt several times throughout its history. The noble house eventually went extinct, and in 1796 the castle was repurposed as a tobacco factory. It also housed a sugar refinery and a gin distillery. Toward the end of the 19th century, a Catholic institution bought the property and added several neo-Gothic buildings to the site. From 1914 to 1970, Meissen Castle functioned as a boarding school for girls. Financed by the Belgian aristocracy, the institution was originally meant for the daughters of men who were serving in World War I. It had a strict set of rules, but gave its students a quality education, teaching them French, Dutch, math, gymnastics, theater, cooking, painting, sewing, and proper etiquette. The girls stayed at the property almost year-round, leaving only for Christmas, Easter, and summer vacation. They were allowed to have visitors once a month. Younger students were looked after by teenage mentors who helped them with basic tasks like dressing themselves and taught them how to behave properly. After the school closed, the site was given to the Ministry of Defense, which did nothing with it. Meissen Castle was abandoned entirely and became a popular attraction among urban explorers. Many people wanted to see it preserved, but the local government refused to protect it, and most of the buildings at the site were demolished. The school's chapel and a few other structures still stand, but for the most part, Meissen Castle lives on only in memory and photographs. Would you have liked to see Meissen Castle in its glory days? Do you know someone that has? Let us know in the comments below, and if you're liking this video, be sure to hit the thumbs up and subscribe buttons if you haven't already. Number 5. Beishan Broadcasting Wall. Located off China's southeastern coast, the Kinmen Islands are governed by Taiwan. The first thing you'll notice as you approach is an eerie concrete tower with 48 circular openings that look like strange windows. But that's not what they are. Known as the Beishan Broadcasting Wall, the three-story structure is filled with loudspeakers that were used for broadcasting propaganda to the Chinese mainland. Built in 1967, it was a tool of sonic warfare, or warfare through sound. At the time, Mao Zedong was at odds with Chiang Kai-shek, a Chinese nationalist leader who opposed the implementation of communism. The broadcasting wall played music by Taiwanese artists, blared anti-communist sentiments, and invited enemy soldiers to defect from China to Taiwan. It could be heard from as far as 15.5 miles away and was used into the 1990s. At certain times, it played non-stop on a loop 24 hours a day. Can you imagine living near it? Ling Ma-ting, who used to live in the Kinmen Islands and is now in her 70s, told the BBC in 2018 that it was mentally exhausting to endure the constant barrage of back-and-forth bickering between enemies. To make matters worse, residents also had to put up with the same type of noise from the communists on the mainland. The wall still plays its original messages today, albeit at a much lower volume and as a tourist attraction, rather than an instrument for manipulating the masses. Number 4. Chateau Miranda. It's always a little sad to see a historic building fall into ruins, and it's even more tragic to see one get demolished. But it can be quite expensive to maintain old structures, and sometimes they just can't be saved, leaving demolition as the most practical and cost-effective choice. One of the saddest examples of a beautiful building that was torn down is the Chateau Miranda, a 19th century neo-Gothic castle in Belgium that was designed and built starting in 1866. It was commissioned by the Likichev Plant family, who had left their previous castle during the French Revolution nearly 70 years earlier. The home had over 100 rooms and construction took a long time. So long, in fact, that it was still being built when its designer, English architect Edward Milner, died in 1884. Chateau Miranda was finally finished in 1907, when its clock tower was erected. The original owner's descendants lived in the house until World War II, when it was taken over by the Nazis during the Battle of the Bulge. In 1950, the National Railway Company of Belgium took ownership of the castle and renamed it Chateau de Noisy. It functioned as an orphanage and a holiday camp for sickly children until the late 1970s. The site became too costly to maintain and was abandoned in 1991. That same year, a huge fire majorly destroyed parts of the castle. At the time, Chateau Miranda was still under the guardianship of the Likichev Plant family, who refused to let the municipal government take over the property. Nobody else wanted to invest in it, and it soon became derelict. The ceilings collapsed, and vandals hastened the castle's decay. It remained popular among urban explorers, but became a major safety concern. With its structural integrity severely compromised by all the damage it had incurred over the years, Chateau Miranda was beyond saving. Demolition began in 2016, and it took about a year for the castle to come down entirely. Photographer Matthew Hampshire had the opportunity to snap some of the last known photos of the spiraling structure before it was razed to the ground. He memorialized the crumbling castle during its final moments, ensuring that it won't be forgotten, even though it no longer exists. Number 3. Broch of Musa. During the Iron Age, a group of ethnic Scottish people called the Picts built at least 500 round hollow towers called brochs. Several of them still stand today, including the Broch of Musa, which at 44 feet high is the tallest remaining structure of its type. It's also one of the best preserved prehistoric buildings in Europe. The Broch of Musa was built around 100 BC. Like other buildings of its kind, it was made from dry stones that were pieced together without mortar. It sits on the island of Musa in the Shetland Islands and is almost entirely intact. Despite being the tallest remaining building of its type, it has one of the smallest diameters and interiors of all the surviving brochs. This is partially because its walls are incredibly thick, which has helped to preserve the structure over time. The building's appearance has been altered several times throughout its history. There's a single entrance at ground level which consists of a 16-foot-long passage. Inside, there's a staircase that leads all the way to the top, as well as a stone bench and a hearth. When the first excavations took place in 1861, workers found a large number of animal skeletons, particularly otters. They probably lived inside the broch after it was abandoned. The team also found a clay pot and pottery shards. Today, Musa serves as a breeding habitat for European storm petrels. There are an estimated 6,800 breeding pairs on the island, some of which make their nests inside the broch itself. Number 2. Cambus Nethan House. The small Scottish village of Overton is home to a Gothic mansion that's falling apart, but is nevertheless breathtaking. Known as Cambus Nethan House, the sandstone structure was built in 1820 for a noble family called the Lockharts of Lee. At the time, the house was surrounded by beautiful, well-kept gardens. During the 1960s, the mansion served as an architect's office. The Cambus Nethan House was slated for demolition in 1967, but a man named Ronald Wilson bought the property and narrowly saved it from being destroyed. He turned it into a restaurant and medieval-themed banquet hall, but numerous safety issues eventually forced it to close, and in 1985 the building was heavily damaged in a fire. There were several attempts to turn the Cambus Nethan House into a hotel, but they all fell through. Safety remained a constant issue, and by 1990 the building's roof had collapsed and it had a severely cracked wall. The ruins stand today as one of the last remaining examples of 19th century neo-Gothic architecture in Scotland. Most of the buildings of this style that once stood throughout the country were demolished during the 1950s and 60s, making the Cambus Nethan House a rarity worth preserving. The Scottish Civic Trust has classified the site as at risk, and a group called the Friends of Cambus Nethan Priory has been fighting to save it from further decay since 2014. Number 1. Animas Forks. The houses in the Colorado ghost town of Animas Forks aren't overly impressive at first glance. In fact, most of the buildings are rather simple and straightforward, reminiscent of the days when people flocked to the area and threw together a log cabin. They were focused on trying to make it big in the mining industry, and their homes were more utilitarian than visually pleasing. In other words, it was a place to sleep between the long hours that were spent chasing after a fortune. But Animas Forks is impressive in its own right because of its altitude. At over 11,000 feet above sea level, it was one of the highest mining camps in the United States. Its population peaked in 1876 at around 450 residents. At the time, the town consisted of 30 cabins, a hotel, a saloon, a general store, and a post office, and it even had its own newspaper. Living at such a high altitude came with challenges. Every winter, residents migrated south to the town of Silverton, which was slightly warmer. In 1884, a 23-day blizzard dumped 25 feet of snow over the town, forcing locals to build tunnels to get from one building to the next. But like most mining towns, the profits dried up, and by 1920, Animas Forks was completely abandoned. Situated along a network of unpaved roads called the Alpine Loop, the ghost town attracts visitors every summer, which is the only time of year that it's reachable without a four-wheel drive vehicle. Thanks for watching. What do you think of this look at what's behind these impressive abandoned structures? Let us know in the comments down below, and don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. Thanks so much, and we'll see you next time for another amazing video right here on American Eye.